So I think everyone knows the rules. So I'm going to start by thanking the Rav for doing yet another one of these. And we are going to move on to the first question, which is from Yehoshua Felberg in Harish. Which day of Purim should a resident of Yerushalayim keep when visiting other places on Purim? What about the other way round? And is there such a thing as being obligated in no days or 2 days?
All right. There is no such thing as being obligated 2 days or 0 days. Despite the claim, I'm not sure it's based on any fact, that Professor Yeshayahu Lebovich, who did not take to the concept of Purim altogether, the story or the joke, I'm not sure what it was, about him was that he used to make sure that he was in Yerushalayim on Yudalad and in Tel Aviv or somewhere else on Tethwal in order to avoid Purim. But you cannot avoid Purim. There's no such thing. Nor are you required to keep 2 days of Purim. If a person is going to be in the place where he lives, where he resides normally on the relevant day, then he keeps Purim on that day. So if a Yerushalmi, if he's going to be in Yerushalayim on Tethwal Ba'adar, he keeps Purim on that day, as all Yerushalmim do. And if he's visiting some other place in the country or anywhere on earth where they keep Purim on Yod Daled, he does not have to keep do any of the mitzvot of Purim. He doesn't have to celebrate Purim on Yod Daled if he's going to be at home on Tethwal. But if he's not going to be, the Yerushalmi is not going to be at home on Tethwal or vice versa, then that person should keep Purim on the day where he's going to be on the relevant day. So a Yerushalmi who's not going to be in Yerushalayim on Tethwal, he is going to be in Bnei Barak on Yod Daled, so he keeps Purim on Yod Daled in Bnei Barak or wherever else it might be.
And it's the cutoff point Alot HaShachar.
Correct. In other words, if you're going if a Yerushalmi is going to be in Yerushalayim Alot HaShachar on Tethwal Ba'adar, then he keeps that day in Yerushalayim, and that's it. He doesn't have to do anything else.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Yehoshua, did you have anything there to be clarified?
Sorry, I think the Rav was about to say something. I just wondered what he was going to add.
I was just going to add that, of course, it does not hurt to hear the Megillah another once or twice if you're going to be somewhere else, or if you wish to join in. If you're visiting family, you wish to go along and be part of the celebrations. If you to have a Seudat Purim, even though it's not Purim for you, that's also fine, of course. So that's not a problem. But you're not hayav to do any of these things.
So can I just ask a clarificatory question? In a place where the custom is, I know my grandfather told me that in Baghdad, the custom was they read the Megillah on Shushan Purim because of Safek, that Baghdad was the walled city. In a place like that, is there an obligation on someone in that area to attend these customary readings on the second day on Shushan Purim?
Well, let me read to you from Rambam. Rambam says in Perek Aleph of Hilchot Megillah v'Hanukah Halacha Yod Aleph, Ir shehi Safek, a city with regards to which there is a doubt whether it is mukefet homa b'yemei Yoshua bin Nun or not. Ve'en yadua im hayata mukefet homa b'yemot Yoshua bin Nun or ahar ken hukefa. Koreim b'shnei hayomim shehem 14 ו-15 uveleileihen. And in that case, you only make a bracha on Yud Daled, says Rambam. Ho'il v'hu zaman kriyata l'rov ha'olam. So, in a place where there's a real safek, I'm not sure I know what the safek is in Shushan, but there doesn't seem to me to be any. The safek is whether it was Miyamot Yeshua bin Nun. Okay, it's not clear. We don't know. Where there is a safek, then it's read on both days, and you make the bracha on Yud Daled.
Thank you. Hazak Baruch.
Okay, thank you, Harav. The next question is it's a mixture of questions from a couple of people, from Chaim Ginsberg and Svi in Queens. How many times is one required to listen to the Megillah? How would the Rav explain the position of the Rambam when he says unambiguously "umiswa likrota b'layla uvayom" without any indication of one being more important than the other?
There is no question that the original takana was to read the Megillah once during the day. No question about that. That's what the Mishnah states. The Mishnah states Kol hayom kasher likriyat haMegillah, all day, but doesn't talk about the night. And the Tosefta discusses whether you can read it from Alot HaShahar or what have you. So it's clear that the mitzvah originally was to read it at night. There was no reading of the Megillah originally. The original mitzvah was to read it during the day. There was no mitzvah to read the Megillah at night. In general, I want to state as a rule of thumb, there was almost nothing, certainly nothing of a communal nature, that Hazal were muthaken to be done at night, for the simple reason that night was a time when it was dark. Sometimes it was dangerous. They didn't have street lighting. As a rule, there were other dangers and problems. At night is a time to be at home with one's family, with one's wife, with one's children, or to study Torah with one's colleagues, with one's havrutha, b'nei havura, whatever the case may be. It's not a time to organize public communal events. So it's no surprise there was no such takana to read the Megillah at night originally. However, we find in the Talmud Yerushalmi, we find a more original version of the minhag of reading at night, where it states that those who know how to read the Megillah are by themselves, because not everyone knows how to read the Megillah. So all people went to the Beth Knesset in the morning to hear the Megillah read. Those who knew and those who didn't know, they all went to hear it read in the morning. In the evening, those who knew how to read at home would read for themselves and their families at home. That's what it states. Haragil would read by himself. Haragil means he who knows how to read from the Tanakh by himself. The word ragil is used in many contexts, referring to a person who knows the pesukim, he knows how to pronounce the words, he knows the nikud, he knows the ta'amim, and therefore he can recite those pesukim without help, either by heart or read it from the text without nikud. That's the ragil, a person who's used to the pesukim, who's familiar with the pesukim. In the Talmud Bavli, we find that statement, a revised version of that statement, which is indicative of something of a process that we find in many, with regards to many halachot, that originally, once upon a time, going back a very long time, things were one way, and over time, certain things were modified or changed in some way. In the Talmud Bavli, that same statement appears differently, and it says that a person is required to hear the Megillah both at night and during the day. And that has, for a very, very long time, probably for at least 1700 or 1800 years, that has been the standard practice. So we should all hear the Megillah both night and day. And the Rambam, basing himself on that statement in the Talmud Bavli, writes, he formulates this halakha in the following way. Rambam uses the following lashon. In halakha gimel, perek aleph, halakha gimel, miswa likrothat kula, you have to read the entire Megillah, because there is a view in the Mishnah that you do not have to read all of the Megillah, only most of it, but not all of it. Miswa likrotha balayla uvayom, and the miswa is to read it at night and day. Rambam is basing himself on the lashon of the Talmud Bavli, which is not surprising at all, although this is not the as I said, not the original takana. This fact finds its expression in the following discussion. Rambam writes that when you read the Megillah at night, you recite 3 brachot, Al Mikra Megillah, She'asa Nisim, and Shehecheyanu, because the first time that you're reading the Megillah for a year, since last year. But not in the morning, because you already read it at night, so it's not brand new. Rabbeinu Tam disagrees. Rabbeinu Tam said, no, you should recite Shehecheyanu in the morning as well. Why? Because the ikar of the mitzvah is the reading of the Megillah during the day, not at night. At night was really a tosefet. It was an additional mitzvah, but it's not the ikar of the mitzvah. The ikar is reading the Megillah during the day, so you should recite Shehecheyanu again in the morning. And frankly, I must admit that Rabbeinu Tam's position makes a lot of sense to me. If it were up to me, and it's not up to me, in other words, I'm not about to, who am I to express an opinion when Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam are discussing something like this and I don't agree. I'm not going to suggest that someone listens to me now, but I'm telling you what would have occurred to me if it was put to me, and Rabbeinu Tam and Rambam had never discussed this issue. I would have said that you should read the Megillah at night without a bracha. No bracha bichlal, not Mikra Megillah and not Shehecheyanu, because it's a tosefet. And the ikar of the mitzvah in the morning is when you make the bracha. And then the whole question of whether you recite Shehecheyanu once or twice, night and morning, or just morning, or just night, or whatever, wouldn't be an issue. But mi'ani or ma'ani. So I didn't say anything. You didn't hear what I just said.
Okay, thank you. Chaim, anything needs to be clarified?
Wait, so just for the Shehecheyanu, practically, what was the Rav's recommendation?
As I said, my da'athi nota kedivra Rabbeinu Tam. My heart leans in the direction of what Rabbeinu Tam says, and it also states in Haga'oth Maimoniot that Marami Rottenburg Lema'aseh was also nahik that way. He was mavarech Shehecheyanu belachash in the morning.
Thank you. And Svi, did you have anything to clarify there? No, you can't hear us. Okay. Thank you very much. Fine. So the next question is from Meir Mozov. If a single word was not heard or misheard, should the whole Megillah be reread?
Ideally, the answer to that question is yes. Practically, it might not always be absolutely technically possible to live up to that standard, but one must do one's utmost to hear all of the Megillah word for word precisely without mistake or without missing a word, etc. Which is one of the reasons I am personally not at all happy with the minhag of making noise every time Haman's name is mentioned. There are minyanim where this minhag is not allowed, and I very much prefer such minyanim. In my own minyanim in the past, that's what we did. In the Temani minyan that I went to for many years in Yerushalayim, that was the practice. There was no disturbance at all when Haman's name was mentioned. There was plenty of noise made before and after, but not during the reading of the Megillah. And I think that is a very proper way to do things for a number of reasons. A, for this very reason that we mentioned here. In other words, sometimes the noise and the commotion results in a word or more not being heard clearly, distinctly by all. And secondly, it's a tirhad sibura. It makes the kriya much longer. If every time Haman is mentioned, you spend 30 seconds being mohayat shemo, well, people's hearts are in the right place, but not everything goes by the heart. You also have to use your head. And that's not a correct, reasonable practice.
Okay, thank you. Meir is not on the line, so we'll move on to the next question. This is from Svi, again in Queens. Can one fulfill one's obligation of hearing Megillah via a live Zoom broadcast?
This question has been discussed. Was mentioned, came up already, not with Zoom, but over the radio decades ago. And the answer is, if it's a live broadcast, it is possible to be also the Hova with such a broadcast. Not a recording, but a live broadcast, yes.
Okay, thank you. Svi, anything there to be clarified? You can unmute yourself.
I believe the question is, what about answering Amen to the bracha? The answer is, again, if it's a live broadcast, the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to the next question, which is from me. May one write, I'm aware that the Rav is of the opinion that one should be able to read as much of Tanakh as possible without nukudot or tamei hamikra, but for those of us like me who can't do that, may one write nukudot and tamei hamikra into the Megillah?
I would not recommend doing that. There are some who would even say it's asur, but it is possible to do the following: to use those transparent sheets of plastic, which you can place over a text, and if you line it up properly, you can place it over the text, which itself is not menukad, but you can place this in Hebrew it's called a shekef. I can't remember what it's called in English. I suppose it's called a transparency or something like that. And you could have the nikud written out so it fits exactly the letters underneath, and you could read it that way. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So we now have a question from Louis Gordon, Benjamin Lincoln, and others. How should we adjust our Purim celebrations given that it is erev Shabbat this year? When should we start and finish the Seudah? And should we ensure it does not ruin our Friday night meal? And what is the best time to have the Seudah when Purim is not on erev Shabbat? All
right. Well, this is a good question, because it's not actually only in a year such as this year when it falls on a Friday. The truth is, I have never understood the practice of being Mekayem Seudat Purim towards the end of the day. I don't see any reason to put it off till the end of the day. Many people start mamash at the end of the day, and most of the Seudah is actually at night after Purim, or at least half of the Seudah is after Purim, and I do not understand such a practice. I can also tell you that in the Ma'aseh Rav of the Gra, which relates and mentions various statements and psakim and minhagim of the Gra, Agon Rabbeinu Eliyahu Mivilna, it states there explicitly that the Gra's view was that one should make the Seudat Purim in the morning. Now, morning doesn't mean 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. necessarily, but I would think that by 12, by midday, that's the right time to sit down to Seudat Purim. That's my view. I know this might clash for some people. It might clash with the children's programs and plans running around the shchuna and the neighborhood and going into this friend and that friend and handing out 150 either Matanot L'Evyonim, or maybe not 150, but mishloach manot. Mishloach manot is a lovely thing, but it doesn't have to, and it shouldn't take over the day to the exclusion of other things. In other words, there is a proper time for that. It should be done at the beginning of the day, shortly after davening in the morning. My recommendation all years, and particularly when Purim falls on erev Shabbat, because Shabbat, Friday is not a very long day, and unless you happen to be in the southern hemisphere, perhaps. Erev Shabbat is not a long day. There are things to be done before Shabbat. We should try and finish the Seudah several hours before Shabbat. One is not really supposed to have a Seudah. Erev Shabbat Bichlal. In other words, let me read to you what Rambam writes about this in general, to do with Fridays, with Erev Shabbat. Rambam writes in Hilchot Shabbat, Perek Shiloshim, Perek Lamed, Halachot Daled, Asur likboa seudah umishta be'erev Shabbat. It is asur to make a special, a big, important meal, a banquet or a celebratory meal such as Seudat Purim on erev Shabbat. Rambam is not referring to Purim, but he's referring to any Friday. You don't make a date with someone to sit down to a nice, relaxed, fancy meal, erev Shabbat, mipnei kavod Shabbat, because of kavod Shabbat, because we wish to enter Shabbat both with an appetite and with enough time to prepare everything lichvod Shabbat, without rushing, without cutting things too fine. So Rambam continues, mutar le'echol v'lishtot ad shetechshach. Be'etzem, it's mutar, you're allowed to eat on Friday till Shabbat enters, and then you have to make Kiddush. V'afal pichen mikevod haShabbat she'imana adam min hamincha u'ma'ala. Nevertheless, one should not sit down to a meal, min hamincha u'ma'ala, which means from 9.5 hours, tesha v'chesi sha'ot zmaniyot. So on average day, 6 to 6, sunrise to sunset, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. That means that one should not be involved in eating a fancy meal or any kind of fixed meal from 3:30 p.m. onwards. Why? So that a person will arrive at Shabbat and the Shabbat meal with a healthy appetite, and the Sudah then is Lichvot Shabbat. If a person sits down to a Sudat Shabbat, Leil Shabbat, after having finished an hour before, or something like that, 2 hours before even, Sudat Purim, which is usually a fairly sumptuous and very satisfying meal, not to mention the quantities of alcohol that some people insist on imbibing during that meal, which we can discuss presently, then frankly most people will not be very eager to sit down to another meal, and that is exactly a lack of kavod Shabbat. So for this reason, specifically on this year, it is a good idea to eat Sudat Purim earlier. But I recommend doing this always, to eat around lunchtime.
Thank you. Is Lewis on the line? I don't see him, but Binyamin is here. Binyamin, do you have anything to be clarified on that?
No, thank you.
I should perhaps just add that with regards to minha, if this time of year, for example, here in Eretz Yisrael, let me just check exactly, but I think that midday is about 10 to 12 now. And the earliest time you can daven minha is about 12:23, shall we say, in Eretz Yisrael. So when you're going to eat a meal in the second half of a large meal in the second half of the day, it is correct to daven minha first. So daven minha at about 12:20, 12:30, and immediately after that, sit down to the meal.
Right, but when it's we're saying that when it's erev Shabbat, it's preferable to eat even earlier than that.
Then you would have to eat. Then you would have to start before Hasoth, which is now about 11:53. So you would have to start about 11, 11:30. But if you haven't started by then daven mincha 12:20, 12:25, 12:30, and then sit down to the meal.
Thank you. Next question is from me. Is it acceptable or even preferable to merge the Seudah with the Shabbat meal? If so, how should one do that? When does one daven Arvit and make Kiddush and Hamosi? And which additions does one make in Birkat Hamazon?
There are those who have such a minhag. I have heard of such a thing. People who start and this is usually people whose general practice, as we just discussed, is to eat to begin Sudat Purim rather late. So they prepare for Shabbat, and they sit and they start the meal, let's say at 4 or something like that. So they begin the meal and they make a break in the middle of the meal, and they go to shul, and they come back and continue. They make kiddush or something like that. I've heard of such people who do this, and they continue the meal. I would not recommend such a practice. I think that Sudat Purim is one mitzvah, and Sudat Shabbat is a separate mitzvah, and Shabbat and Purim do not need to be and should not really be merged unnecessarily. If there's absolutely no choice, then that would be an option. But what do I mean by no choice? Soldiers in the army who are on patrol or active duty, there are various activities that they have to do at certain times, and that is the only practical option that they have, then okay, then I would go for that, definitely. And in that case, you could start the meal towards the end of the day, and then you could be pores mapal makadesh in the middle of the meal. You could say kiddush in the middle of the meal, and then continue and into Shabbat, etc. But I wouldn't recommend that lechatchila.
Okay, thank you, Harav. The next question is from Yehoshua Felberg again. Is it preferable to wear weekday Shabbat on Purim as opposed to fancy dress or regular weekday clothing?
It is not necessary to wear weekday Shabbat. It's not Shabbat, and it's not Yom Tov. And the halachic status of Purim is similar to that of Hanukkah. You don't find people claiming or practically wearing Shabbat clothes all of Hanukkah. There's no reason to think you should do it on Purim. It's not asur, but again, I think that Shabbat, which is a more special and more holy day than Purim by far, should be separate and should be special. And Shabbat clothes really should be kept for Shabbat and Yom Tov, and not for Purim. But some sort of midway station, somewhere between weekday clothing and adding something a bit different, something a bit more mechubad, something a bit more formal or fancy, is fine. It's not a bad idea at all.
Okay, thank you. Yehoshua, anything there to be clarified?
Thank you, Kavod Rav. If I understand correctly, then it's better to refrain from fancy dress, which is the common practice, and to wear something a bit more mechubad for the occasion?
No, I was not referring to fancy dress. If a person wishes to wear fancy dress or costumes or what have you, it's mutar. I personally don't do it, but that's just me. Everyone can wear whatever they wish, whatever makes them feel good, whatever they feel is appropriate in the spirit of the day. Many people have this minhag of wearing interesting clothing, shall we say, on Purim, and that's perfectly okay. That's not a problem. I don't consider that in any way reprehensible. Maybe the opposite is true. I would just add a few words regarding costumes for children, or for that matter for adults, but it's usually more of an issue with regards to children. Costumes are fine. Purim is a wonderful day and it should be celebrated, but that does not mean we should all of a sudden throw to the four winds the concept of not going, not walking, not practicing, and acting like darchei ha'emori. In other words, lo lidamot lagoyim, and wearing things that we would normally on other days consider improper or not Jewish or undesirable in various ways. Purim does not make things which are undesirable or improper other days of the year. The Purim does not make them acceptable on Purim.
Can I ask something about that?
By all means.
Would if we can be a little bit more specific, let's say we're talking about nothing non-tsanua, but children dressing in cartoon characters, Superman, that type of thing. Would you say that's derech ha'emori?
I cannot tell you that seeing children dressed up as Spider-Man or the like makes my heart sing. I cannot say that. It doesn't. Not really. I'm not going to say it's asur, but I think there are probably better things we can come up with.
Thank you, Arav. So the next question was from Meir Morozov. What are the basic minimum requirements for mishloach, manot, and Matanot L'Evyonim?
For mishloach manot, it should be food that is ready to eat or drink immediately. Preferably, ideally, it should be food that can be or is appropriate to be part of the Sudath Purim, that a person will be able to place on the table and consume as part of the Sudath Purim. So it can be some cooked dish, or it could be, some people bake bread rolls and send a couple of bread rolls to a neighbor or to a friend, or some other food that is appropriate for the Seudah itself. That's the idea. It's really directed towards the Seudah itself, sending people copious quantities of lollies, sweets, candies, or whatever term you prefer, depending on which English-speaking country you come from, on that day. That's not really the idea of mishloach manot. It's not about providing parnasah for dentists. It's about sharing tasty food with friends and neighbors that they can have at their Sudath Purim. That's the guiding principle. And it has to be 2 manot, mishloach manot berabim. Manot is 2, so it should be 2. I can read to you again Rambam's definition. Rambam writes as follows in Perek Bet Halachot Tethwal. First of all, and it's connected. These things are connected. That's why, as I suggested just now, so I'm also going to read to you what Rambam says about the Seudah, and then he immediately follows on to the Yanu Mishloach Manot. Rambam says, Kesav Hovat Seudah Zo. She'ochal Basar. One should eat. What does one do? How does one perform this mitzvah of Sudath Purim? One eats meat. In other words, tasty, special food, the kind of food that people usually have at special meals at special times. Should be an impressive, sumptuous meal according to his means. And drink wine. Now Rambam, we can discuss this more in a moment. Rambam says, I wish to add a few words about that perhaps in a moment. Rambam, some people would translate this as meaning that you should drink wine to the point of getting drunk. I don't think that's what Rambam means. Then Rambam immediately goes on to say, and even connects the next statement with the wow. He says, Wached, and similarly, Hayav lishloach shte manot shel avasar or shel mine tavshil or shne mine ochalim lahaviro. In other words, Rambam speaks about sending 2 types of meat or other cooked meal. It should be something cooked, preferably, to his friends, to a friend. So the minimum requirement is shte manot, 2 kinds of preferably cooked or baked food, which is shayach, which is relevant to the meal. to one person. That's the minimal requirement. You can give more. You can give to 2, 3, 4, or even 10 people. Some people, really, I think, exaggerate and prepare 30 mishloach manot for 30 people, and that's one of the reasons they start their Seudah at 3 or 4 p.m. because they're spending hours driving around handing out all these mishloach manot, and I think that's a little bit overdone. With regards to Matanot L'Evyonim, Rambam says, وَحَيَاv لَحَلَيْك لَعَنِيِّم بَيَوْمَ HaPurim. You have to give tzedakah to, and again, it's for the purpose of the Seudah, so that all people will be able to celebrate Purim properly. En pahot mishne aniyim, at least 2 poor people. Noten lechol echad matana achad. Each is to be given one amount of money, or ma'ot, or minei tavshil, or minei ochalim, or some kinds of food. So that, again, for the reason that people will be able to celebrate the day properly. So Matanot L'Evyonim and mishloach manot and Seudat Purim are all various aspects of various aspects of the same mitzvah of celebrating Purim in a proper fashion, so that all people will be able to do so. I see that someone asked the question regarding Matanot L'Evyonim. Yes, I, as always, will be making sure that some funds are distributed to certain needy people on Purim. Yes. Lina.
Thank you. Mayor, do you have anything to be clarified about the mishloach manot and Matanot L'Evyonim question?
No, perfect. As always, thank you, Rav.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now on to a question from Svi in Queens. Is there a mitzvah to drink wine on Purim, though not to get drunk? Is red wine preferable? And can one drink other alcoholic beverages instead?
Okay, let's begin at the end. Is red wine preferable? No, there's no preference for the type of alcoholic beverage. Wine is what is mentioned by Hazal because that was the most common beverage. They did have beer, true, particularly in Bavel, in Eretz Yisrael, perhaps less so. But there's no preference for dafka red wine. It can be white wine. It can be any kind of wine. It can be beer. It can be other kinds of alcoholic beverages. Should one get drunk on Purim? Absolutely, emphatically, no. I do not believe that is the meaning of the statement in Masechet Megillah, which speaks about liv sumeh or lav sumeh or lab besumeh. That word in Aramaic does not mean to get drunk. The word in Aramaic to get drunk is liruye, milashon raweh, resh, waw, yod. Wherever the term is used in the Targum Onkelos and other places, in the Talmud as well, when it speaks about getting drunk, mamash, then it does not use the word labesumeh. It talks about liruye. We see this in Masechet Berachot, where Eliyahu Navi says to Rav Shimon Hasidah, La tirweh wa la tehete. Do not get drunk and you will not sin. In other words, because being drunk can lead to all kinds of improper practices. It doesn't say la ibsemeh or something like that. It doesn't use that shoresh. It uses the shoresh of raweh. It says la tirweh wa la tehete. And that's very deliberate. In Masechet Megillah, when it says mihayav enesh la b'someh, it means to, as we say in English, to drink to the point of being a little bit loosened up, shall we say, a bit more than usual, but not more than that. Now, some people might describe it as being a bit jolly, but in a very controlled manner, but in no way is it talking about being drunk. Now, a person might say, but didn't you just read from the Rambam? The Rambam says, I think that Rambam's use of that lashon there is imprecise. In other words, when the word lehishtaker in Hebrew can sometimes mean, as in this case it does, I think, in the Rambam, can sometimes mean to drink again, so to the point that it has some effect on you, but not that you should become drunk. In other words, what we all know, many people I think react this way when they drink some alcoholic beverages. It tends to make them drowsy. Now, being drowsy is not the same as being drunk, as we all know, right? Some people might be drowsy after 1 glass of wine, and some people after 2 glasses of wine, and some people after 2 glasses of beer, and some people after 1 or 2 shots of whiskey or what have you. That's fine. If it makes you a bit drowsy, that's exactly what Rambam was talking about, because Rambam said, and I quote again precisely, Rambam says in Perek Beth, Hilchot Megillah, Halachot Tet, after he spoke about eating a nice fancy meal, with shotheh yain, and one drinks wine, ad sheishtaker v'yeravem b'shichrut, and one literally falls asleep. In other words, one becomes drowsy. Normally, if one is not pressed for time or doesn't have other obligations, if you become drowsy, what do? You go to sleep, you take a nap. That's fine. That's exactly what is meant. Becoming drunk to the point that one acts like a fool and inconveniences other people and vomits and acts in a way which is totally animalistic and unacceptable and entirely not Jewish, is and opposed to what the Torah teaches us in every way, in every respect. That is entirely not what that statement of the Gemara was meant to imply. And this, what I'm telling you now, one can find by looking in the Tur and in the Beth Yosef on this halacha, and you will see that the Beth Yosef brings several sources from Rishonim, all to the effect that one must not get drunk on Purim.
Thank you. I think the other part of the question was maybe the Rab already answered this about other alcoholic beverages other than wine.
I did mention that all alcoholic beverages are fine.
Right.
If drunk, what's the term I want?
In moderation.
Thank you. That's exactly the word I was looking for. Thank you very much. In moderation, exactly.
Okay, thank you. So we're now moving on to another question about fancy dress, again from Yehoshua Feldberg. Is it permissible to daven the Amida while in fancy dress or costumes?
On Purim, it is mutar to do so. Rav Kook, Rabbeinu Agadol Rav Kook Zetzal even writes in a Teshuvah, not exactly on this question, but something related. He speaks about whether it's mutar for a person who is somewhat under the influence of alcohol, that he's drunk on Purim, but not to the point that he's stone drunk. Whether it's mutar for him to daven Shmon Esrei in that state on Purim, and he says yes, on Purim it's mutar, but not if one is completely drunk. So somewhat, but even then, again, one needs to be very careful, because to overstep the mark for most of us it's a very fine line, and it's easy to go too far, and it's easy to tell yourself it's a mitzvah today, etc., and before you know it, you're well beyond the reasonable point of no return. So caution and common sense and a proper understanding of what is intended is necessary. The statement of the Gemara, I think, was made. The intention of the lashon of the Talmud, I think, should be understood as follows: what does that mean? In order not to have no understanding of between these two concepts, you have to be truly shikor kalot. You have to be completely drunk, and that's not what we mean. What it means to say is the whole story of Purim, the events of Purim, the Megillah, teaches us that even in the most apparently mundane and earthly goings on and machinations, political machinations, and all the rivalries and all the planning and various actions that different people and different factions plot and plan against each other, and all that goes on in the world around us, which is seemingly random and without any direction or purpose. Hashem is always behind the scenes, is always fine-tuning and directing events. And the whole Megillah teaches us this lesson. We see in the Megillah all kinds of goings on. We hear about a banquet and Vashti did this and she didn't do that, and she ended up being replaced, and it ended up being Esther, and then such and such happened, and Mordechai happened to be aware of a certain plot, and he happened to mention it to Esther, and Esther mentioned it to Ahasuerus, and eventually this led to all the other events with which we are all familiar. In other words, apparently on the surface, there's no connection between all these events. They're entirely random, happenstance, and these things, could have happened this way or that way. The whole purpose is to tell us that that Hashem is always behind the scenes, and we must never despair. And Hashem is always, even sometimes the most unlikely and some even incredible places or situations and scenarios, such as the Persian court, which is a very non-Torah place. Not everything that we read in the Megillah tells us that the Persian court and the goings on there and the people that one ran into on a daily basis there were not exactly the kind of people that we would want to, a Torah Jew would want to spend his time with or be involved with and have to even meet on a daily basis. But even there, Hashem directs events when the Jewish people are concerned, when they are involved, and L'Ma'aseh, we are involved in almost everything that goes on. And if you don't believe me, look at the newspapers all around the world, every day of the year, every year. Israel's always mentioned there for some reason on page 1 or page 2. Whatever's going on, we're always uppermost in everybody's minds, because somehow we're always involved, for either for good or for bad, or in the eyes and the minds of others, either for good or for bad. But we're always there. So everything is to be, all the things that we see going on around us, all the events, historical events, political events, ups and downs, disappointments, and more apparently successful or happier occurrences. All these things are fit into Hashem's plan, and we cannot always see this, not immediately, and sometimes not for a very long time, or perhaps never. But the Megillah teaches us that this is always the case, and therefore, drink. Now, what has it got to do with drinking? Drinking a moderate amount of alcohol has this effect of opening one's mind to seeing things in a slightly different light, to being able to perceive things in a way which one is perhaps less likely to be able to perceive. It's conducive to broadening one's perspective. As Rava says in Masechet Sanhedrin, in the Talmud Bavli Daf Ayin, Hamra v'rehane pakhin, wine and fragrant substances literally added to my wisdom. In other words, these physical and special materials, these substances have an effect, can have a positive effect on the mind, on one's perception, on one's thoughts, and it depends a lot on the person. These things tend to do, they bring out that which is hidden perhaps a little bit beneath the surface of the person. So if you give alcohol to your average Tom, Dick, or Harry, it tends to bring out very frequently negative things, because that's what's lurking just beneath the surface. And when that same substance is used by a Torah Jew, it does not bring out those same things. And if it does, or if it seems to, then that's the best proof that that person should not be engaging in such practices at this point. That the person still has a way to go before allowing himself to partake of such things.
Okay, thank you, Harav. I think it was your question about davening the Amida in costume. Do you have anything to be clarified there, Yoshua?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And the next question was also from Yoshua. Is it permitted, I think I've touched on this before, but is it permitted to bring young children to the Beth Knesset to hear the Megillah if one knows that these children are likely to make lots of noise during the Kriya?
It's a good thing to bring children to the Beth Knesset, but only if they are not going to disturb the Sibur and the misheard that we are trying to perform at that time. So it depends on their age and then how one assesses their likely behavior.
Thank you. Yoshua, anything to clarify?
No, that's clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, a few of the questions that came through on the chat. So firstly, are there any places in Eretz Yisrael that the Rav would consider to have the status of mukaf? And what is the Rav's view on that issue of whether any towns, whether there are any towns in Eretz Yisrael where you'd have to keep Shushan Purim, other than Yerushalayim?
That's a good question. Not a very simple question. Historically, for centuries, we all know that this has been the case in Yerushalayim. And I should also just say briefly with regards to Yerushalayim, there are those. Initially, this view was expressed by Hagon Arav Michal Tukchinsky, but going back 100 years or so. He claimed that the status of Yerushalayim with regards to Shushan Purim, or Purim de Mukafim, only applies 2,000 amah, roughly a kilometer, from the walls of the old city. And he even mentions that therefore the cutoff point is a certain house on a certain street in Geula. He mentions the house and the number of the house in that street. In other words, up to that point it's Yerushalayim, and from that point onwards it's not Yerushalayim any longer. No well-known Rabbanim that as far as I know, ever agreed with this position, and I certainly do not agree with that position. I think that as long as Yerushalayim, as long as we're talking about one continuous metropolis, a great city which there's no clear break, and then a clear empty area, and then another yishuv or another town, as long as we're talking about one continuous place, Yerushalayim begins at the center in the old city, but as long as, if it expands over time, okay, that's the natural way of the world. When Chazal said that Kerach, Mukefet Homa, reason Megillah on Tethwal, this certainly took into account the fact and the possibility and almost the certainty that such a place over time will expand, or is likely to expand. And it will not remain the same size, cover the same area for all time. Over time, cities tend to grow. So that was part of the Tachanun. Now, with regards to other parts of Eretz Yisrael, it seems to me that in Hebron, it should be Dafka on Tethwel, and I can't really see why there should be a Safek, although some serious Rabbanim, local Rabbanim there have said otherwise. The same I would say with regards to Beth El. There's next to no doubt at all that present-day Beth El is samuch v'nireh to the original Beth El, which was definitely Mukefet Choma in the time of Yoshua bin Nun. But actually, there are further questions with regards to this, because it's possible that the intention, although this is not what's the usual practice, but it's possible that the original intention of Hazal was that any major city, that's really what they had in mind, should be considered a Ir Mukefet Choma. With regards to certain places that are mentioned in the Tanakh, as someone just mentioned on the chat, we don't know exactly we don't always know exactly where that place was. Sometimes we do. In the case of Beth El, I believe we know very well. And there are certain other examples perhaps as well. But this is a more involved question. So we'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 2 minutes left. So just a question about Tachanun outside. The question was, do minyanim outside of Yerushalayim say Tachanun on the 16th of Adar? But I think maybe, not sure if that was supposed to be the 15th of Adar. I don't remember who asked that question. Whoever asked that question, please.
He meant the 16th. He actually, I responded to him. I thought he also meant the 15th. He meant specifically in a year like this with Purim mishloach.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
I do not see any reason why those who are not celebrating Purim on a given day should not refrain from saying Tachanun on that day. So on Tet Zayin Ba'adar this year, on the 16th of Adar, I do not see why people in other places where they already celebrated Purim, I don't see why they should not say Tachanun.
That would apply even in a regular year, that someone outside Yerushalayim would say Tachanun on the 15th.
I think so, yes.
Okay. Thank you. And the final question, someone asked if there's a minimum to be Yotzei Matanot L'Evyonim.
It needs to be enough to allow a person who doesn't have the funds to buy a reasonable amount of food, as we described, some meat, some wine, some good food, sufficient for a decent Sudat Purim.
Okay.
So in
Thank you very much.
Israeli terms, that might be something between 50 and 100 shekel, I suppose.
Okay. Thank you very much, Erev. I think we've reached 9 o'clock. So very grateful for the last time again. I'm going to end the meeting now, and Purim Sameach to everyone, and many thanks to the Rav and everyone who took part.
Shalom, shalom. שנזכה תמיד לשמוח ולרבות בשמחות. יזכו ויאמץ לבבכם כל המייחלים לאדוני. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.